Standing near the manicured hydrangeas in the sun-drenched backyard of our South Hills residence, I watched 40 guests clink crystal glasses, their polished laughter floating across a Mother's Day celebration that felt entirely alien to me. I was 39 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps, with 15 years of service behind me. Yet in this crowded courtyard, I was nothing more than an uninvited phantom at my own table. Every single detail of this opulent gathering, from the artisanal prosciutto platters and imported French wines to the silk linens draped over mahogany tables, had been financed entirely by my personal checking account. I had spent 15 years enduring freezing night patrols in Kandahar and dusty convoy operations in Helmand, wiring my combat hazard pay home so my family could build a life of security and dignity. Instead, I stood in the shadow of my own hard-won achievement, watching my 40-year-old brother, Julian, circulate through the crowd in a tailored Italian silk suit that my credit card had purchased. Julian swirled his aged bourbon, puffing his chest out like a self-made titan of industry, loudly accepting praise from country club acquaintances for throwing such an extravagant party for our mother, Eleanor. He smiled broadly, slapping backs and taking credit for the lavish spread, never once mentioning my name or acknowledging the woman whose blood and sweat had paid for every drop of liquor in their hands. As I stood there, holding a flimsy paper plate, swallowed by the suffocating silence of my own restraint, I realized with brutal clarity how deeply my sacrifice had been weaponized against me. I had poured my lifeblood into this household, believing I was rescuing my family from the cold grips of poverty, only to realize I had merely bankrolled a gilded theater of lies. The people who were supposed to guard my flank had systematically scraped my accounts bare, transforming my grueling military service into their personal venture capital fund, while erasing my very existence from the home I had built. They reveled in my absence, fed on my sacrifice, and treated my survival as their permanent financial right. The fragile veneer of domestic celebration shattered completely when my 65-year-old mother, Eleanor, stepped toward the center of the patio, holding her wine glass high before turning her gaze directly toward me with a chilling, calculated malice. The ambient chatter of 40 guests died down into an expectant hush as she held up her hands, her face twisting into a mask of bitter resentment that had festered beneath her practiced suburban charm for years. In front of our neighbors, colleagues, and extended family, she looked right through my eyes and hissed words that cut deeper than any shrapnel I had ever encountered overseas. I wish you were never my daughter. The military turned you into a heartless, cold-blooded monster who cares about nothing but rules and cold efficiency. A collective gasp echoed across the lawn. But Eleanor wasn't finished, fueled by decades of toxic favoritism and an insatiable appetite for my financial submission. Beside her, Julian offered a smug, theatrical smirk, tapping his fingers against the polished hood of the dark charcoal SUV parked in the driveway, a luxury vehicle I had purchased with 14 months of combat zone tax-free savings after surviving one of the deadliest deployments of my career. Look at her standing there, acting like she owns the place, just because she wears a uniform. Julian sneered loudly, tossing his head back as his pampered wife, Chloe, giggled into her silk scarf. She doesn't know what real family sacrifice means. She thinks a military paycheck gives her the right to judge how real adults live. Standing under the harsh afternoon sun, listening to the two people I had bled for degrade my honor and mock my sacrifice, something fundamental inside my chest fractured. A quiet, sharp break that happened so fast, it didn't even register as pain. They saw my disciplined silence not as love, but as a sign of endless vulnerability, convinced that their golden boy's unearned arrogance outweighed 15 years of my service. Their cruel words severed the final thread of filial obligation that had held my spirit hostage for far too long. In that devastating moment of absolute clarity, I knew that I would never again allow them to diminish my humanity or treat my sacrifice as their birthright. In that frozen, agonizing heartbeat, the desperate civilian daughter who had spent 15 years begging for her mother's approval finally died, replaced entirely by the immovable, lethal discipline of a United States Marine officer. I did not cry, nor did I allow my shoulders to slump under the suffocating weight of their public humiliation. Instead, I brought my heels together, straightened my spine to parade rest height, and locked my eyes onto Eleanor's pale, venomous face. "Then from now on," I replied, my voice ringing out across the silent patio with a freezing, immovable composure that dropped the ambient temperature of the yard by 10 degrees. "Live as if you never gave birth to me." Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel with sharp military precision, my boots striking the stone pavers with a measured, deliberate cadence that echoed like a drumbeat. I marched straight toward Julian, who was still leaning nonchalantly against the hood of my SUV, his smug smile faltering as he registered the terrifying shift in my posture. Before he could react or utter another arrogant word, I reached out and snatched the heavy brass key fob straight out of his manicured fingers with a swift, unyielding motion that left him gasping in surprise. "Hey, that's my ride! You can't take that!" Julian yelled, his voice cracking with panicked embarrassment as his country club friends watched his illusion of wealth crumble in real time. Ignoring his pathetic shouts, I unlocked the driver's door, stepped up into the pristine leather cabin, and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing out the toxic noise of my family. I hit the engine start button, felt the powerful V8 roar to life beneath my hands, shifted aggressively into reverse, and backed out of the driveway, hitting the gas as I merged onto the highway, leaving the gilded theater of my past behind in a cloud of dust. That single decisive act was my first step toward reclaiming my dignity from the very people who should have honored it. As I accelerated down the highway, the heavy silence of the cabin felt less like isolation and more like the clean, sacred space of a long overdue liberation. 10 minutes into the drive, as the afternoon sun beat relentlessly against the windshield, my phone vibrated violently against the leather passenger seat, its screen illuminating with a frantic stream of threat notifications from my mother. I glanced down briefly to see a text message from Eleanor that read in all capital letters, "Bring the car back right now or I'm calling the cops. You are a thief and I will make sure you rot in jail." A cold, quiet smile spread across my face, an expression devoid of humor, forged in the iron stillness of someone who had commanded troops through actual battlefields and no longer feared paper tigers. I reached over with one hand, unlocked the screen, and typed exactly 2 words in response. "Call them." I flipped the phone face down onto the passenger seat, completely severing the digital lifeline my family had used to bleed me dry for over a decade. As the highway asphalt rolled beneath my tires, I engaged tactical breathing, inhaling deeply for 4 seconds, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, and holding empty for 4, forcing my elevated heart rate down to a steady 60 beats per minute, precisely as I had been trained to do under enemy mortar fire. The physical distance between my vehicle and that toxic backyard widened with every passing mile. But the psychological shift was even more monumental. I realized that my mother's threat was the ultimate proof of her delusion. She truly believed that the legal system, like her own twisted morality, belonged to her. Sitting behind the wheel of a vehicle whose title, registration, and insurance bore only one name, Grace Vance, I felt the heavy, suffocating fog of guilt lift from my chest. I was no longer a frightened child begging for crumbs of affection. I was an officer returning to her post, ready to dismantle the empire of parasites I had foolishly funded. The road ahead was long, but my mind was completely clear, anchored in an unshakable resolve to fight for my own soul and reclaim my destiny. For the first time in 15 long years, I felt completely unburdened by their expectations, knowing that the truth was an unyielding shield that no lie could ever pierce. The absolute horror for my family materialized exactly 45 minutes later, when 3 marked police cruisers tore down Maple Ridge Drive, their red and blue strobe lights flashing violently against the manicured lawns of South Hills. The high-pitched wail of police sirens shattered the quiet evening, pulling neighbors out onto their porches as the patrol cars pulled into our driveway, blocking Julian's escape route and surrounding the house with clinical precision. Eleanor stood on the porch, her face flushed with self-righteous triumph, pointing frantically at the empty driveway where my SUV had been parked, completely convinced that the officers were there to launch a statewide manhunt for her ungrateful daughter. Julian stood beside her, puffing out his chest and attempting to adopt the authoritative posture of a wealthy property owner speaking to public servants, demanding that they immediately issue a felony warrant for grand theft auto. However, the scene spiraled out of their control the moment the lead officer stepped onto the porch, carrying a digital dossier provided directly by the precinct dispatcher, following my swift electronic transmission of the vehicle's original bill of sale, title, and registration. When the officers realized that Julian had filed a sworn, fraudulent stolen vehicle report against the sole legal owner of the SUV, an active-duty lieutenant colonel, their professional demeanor hardened into cold enforcement. Before Julian could process the sudden shift in the air or offer another arrogant lie, the lead officer grabbed his arm, spun him around against the brick pillar, and pulled his hands roughly behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the silent porch as the officers informed a pale, sputtering Julian that he was under arrest for filing a false police report and grand theft fraud. Eleanor shrieked in absolute terror, clutching her chest as her golden boy was led down the steps in restraints, completely unaware that the war had just begun. Their reign of exploitation was ending, shattered by the very law they had tried to weaponize against me. Standing in the falling dusk, surrounded by blue lights, they were finally forced to confront the cold, unyielding reality of their own deceitful choices. I pulled the heavy charcoal SUV onto the gravel shoulder of Interstate 77, the tires crunching loudly against the loose stone, before I finally killed the powerful V8 engine. The sudden, absolute silence inside the cabin pressed against my eardrums with immense weight, broken only by the low, ticking rhythm of the cooling exhaust pipe beneath the chassis. I leaned my head back against the plush leather headrest, closing my eyes as my trembling fingers released their white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. The very same premium leather wheel that my brother, Julian, had picked out at the dealership while casually swiping my credit card without a second thought. For minutes, I just sat there in the quiet stillness, listening to the rushing sound of distant highway traffic, feeling the cold, biting air from the air vents settle over my skin. Sitting alone on that isolated stretch of West Virginia highway, I engaged tactical breathing, inhaling for 4 seconds, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, and holding empty for 4, forcing my elevated heart rate down just as I had been trained to do under enemy mortar fire in combat zones. Yet, no amount of military conditioning could completely shield my spirit from the agonizing realization that was physically suffocating me in the quiet cab. I recognized with terrifying clarity how perilously thin the boundary was between a loving, supportive home and a nest of absolute human parasites. For 15 years, I had operated under the comforting, naive delusion that my family stood as my ultimate sanctuary, a safe harbor where I could lay down my heavy armor after surviving the horrors of war. Instead, sitting beside mile marker 42, I was forced to swallow the bitter, unvarnished truth that the very people who were supposed to guard my flank downrange were the ones gleefully plunging a dagger into my back. Every mile of asphalt between myself and that toxic backyard was a step toward emotional liberation. But the painful realization of their parasitic betrayal cut straight to the core of my soul. I sat in the dim interior light, feeling the weight of 15 unappreciated years wash over me, knowing that the domestic peace I had fought so hard to purchase was nothing more than an expensive illusion designed to keep me trapped in an endless cycle of exploitation. As I kept my eyes closed in the silent car, memories of my grueling deployments returned like sharp shrapnel piercing through a flak jacket, burning my spirit with unyielding intensity. I vividly remembered the freezing night patrols in Kandahar, where the Arctic mountain wind sank deep into my bones while I scanned dark, desolate rooftops through thermal optics for 8 hours straight without moving a single muscle. I remembered the torrential rain mixing with pools of dark blood on the metal floors of medevac helicopters, my calloused hands applying relentless pressure to a 19-year-old corporal's shattered leg while the rotors screamed overhead, fighting desperately to keep him talking so we wouldn't slip into fatal shock. I remembered countless silent missions in the desert darkness where I wrote farewell letters to my family in my head, genuinely believing I would never survive to see another sunrise over American soil. During those blood-soaked, terrifying nights, the single burning anchor that kept my soul from surrendering to despair was a fierce, desperate hunger to lift my family out of generational poverty. Every single cent of my combat pay, hazard bonuses, and overseas allowances had been wired directly into my mother Eleanor's bank account, trusting her blindly to secure our future and clear Julian's suffocating debts. Yet, while I was dodging mortar fire and sleeping in dirt trenches thousands of miles from home, Julian was using my blood money to tailor Italian silk suits, lease luxury sedans, and host lavish champagne dinners for non-existent business partners. He transformed my life-threatening sacrifices into his personal venture capital fund, stripping my bank accounts bare to inflate his fragile, pathetic ego while playing the role of a successful entrepreneur at my expense. Every dollar that funded his delusion of grandeur was earned by me, on my knees, in the mud, praying I would survive another day in the desert. He built a kingdom of cards on my scars, basking in unearned applause while I bled in silence, never once questioning whether the money he spent so freely was stained with my sacrifice. Sitting in the quiet SUV, the depth of his callous greed settled into my bones like ice, cementing my resolve to tear down his house of cards. Opening my eyes, I stared blankly at the empty asphalt stretching toward the horizon, watching the late afternoon shadows lengthen across the interstate as the harsh reality of my domestic life crystallized. In my family's eyes, I was never a beloved daughter, a devoted sister, or a decorated Marine Corps officer who had earned every promotion through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. I was merely a shiny, emotionless, automated teller machine, designed to spit out crisp bills on command whenever they pressed a button. My mother pressed the button of filial guilt. My brother spent the cash with arrogant entitlement. And no one in that household ever paused to ask if the machine had a beating heart or carried deep emotional wounds. The red flags I had deliberately ignored for years out of a desperate desire for affection now stood out as sharp and lethal as combat knives. I recalled Julian standing on our porch last Thanksgiving, swirling expensive bourbon bought with my credit card while patting the hood of this very SUV in front of his wealthy country club friends. He had puffed out his chest, smirked arrogantly, and declared, "This is my new ride," taking full credit for a luxury vehicle purchased with 14 months of my combat savings, without ever mentioning my name. I remembered sitting quietly on the porch steps, holding a paper plate of potato salad, completely erased from my own hard-won achievement, while my sister-in-law, Chloe, announced to our extended family that my fully paid-off house was her husband's inherited ancestral home. I had stood in the corner picking at a loose thread on my sleeve, saying absolutely nothing, allowing them to claim my blood-bought property as their birthright. I had swallowed my pride and accepted their disrespect, mistakenly believing that my silent tolerance was the price I had to pay to earn a mother's love. In truth, my passivity had only served to invite deeper cruelty, feeding their insatiable greed until there was nothing left of me to take. Looking back at those moments of cowardly silence, a cold, unyielding rage replaced my grief, transforming my quiet tolerance into a sharp, uncompromising clarity. The deepest, most lethal cut, however, had always come from my mother, Eleanor, whose subtle psychological manipulation had kept my spirit bound in invisible chains for over a decade. I could vividly hear her heavy, irritated sigh echoing through the phone receiver every single time a major wire transfer cleared into her account, a sound that made my stomach twist into knots. She would hold up the bank receipt between two manicured fingers as if it were something dirty, roll her eyes in disgust, and sneer, "This little bit of money is nothing compared to an officer's salary. You have it easy in the military, while your poor brother struggles at home." Eleanor had weaponized my professional success, transforming my grueling, life-threatening combat deployments into a paid vacation in her twisted narrative, while elevating Julian's chronic laziness into heroic martyrdom. In her perverted worldview, the child who bled in foreign deserts for her country was lazy and privileged, while the 35-year-old son who sat at home spending his sister's blood money was the golden saint who truly suffered. Every phone call from her ended the exact same way. A heavy sigh, a veiled insult about my cold nature, and an unspoken demand for more cash to fix Julian's latest financial disaster. Yet, beneath my mother's toxic favoritism lay the deep, unhealed scar of my father Arthur's death, a hard-working auto mechanic who had died of a sudden heart attack when I was 23, just weeks before my first overseas deployment. After Arthur passed, Eleanor expertly shifted the burden of survival onto my young shoulders, convincing me through relentless gaslighting that keeping the family afloat financially was my sacred duty to my father's memory. I had allowed her to weaponize my grief, converting my reverence for my late father into an endless financial pipeline that enabled my brother's parasitic lifestyle. I had confused honoring his memory with feeding their greed, trapped in a cage of emotional blackmail that I was finally ready to shatter. Sitting on that gravel shoulder, staring at my reflection, I swore that Arthur's legacy would no longer be stained by their endless exploitation. Sitting alone on the gravel shoulder near mile marker 42, the desperate civilian daughter who had spent 15 years begging for breadcrumbs of love finally faded away, replaced by the immovable resolve of a United States Marine. The pathetic civilian grief that had clouded my judgment dissolved into a freezing, tactical clarity that settled over my chest like impenetrable iron. I realized with absolute certainty that enabling my brother's chronic entitlement, vanity, and laziness was not an act of sisterly love. It was a profound crime against his soul and my own dignity. By bankrolling his lifestyle, I had not helped Julian become a man. I had stripped him of any capacity to function as an adult, transforming him into a weaker, more delusional parasite with every check I wrote. I was the one who had nurtured the monster that eventually turned its fangs on me in my own backyard. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, locking eyes with the cold, determined officer staring back at me, and made an unshakable vow that the era of the silent ATM was officially terminated. The victim mentality died right there on Interstate 77, buried beneath the weight of 15 years of unhonored sacrifice and a renewed sense of self-respect. Reaching forward, I hit the ignition button, felt the powerful V8 engine rumble beneath my hands, and shifted the heavy SUV back into drive with a swift, decisive motion. My heavy combat boot pressed down firmly on the accelerator, merging the vehicle back onto the open highway as I pointed the hood straight toward the fortified gates of Camp Lejeune. The tears I had anticipated never fell. In their place burned a steady, sacred flame of liberation, guiding me toward the military base where my true duty lay, ready to execute a long overdue mission of absolute financial justice. I drove forward into the fading twilight, no longer running from a painful past, but marching purposefully toward a future forged in truth, honor, and unyielding self-worth. With every mile that clicked away on the odometer, the heavy chains of guilt loosened, leaving me whole, empowered, and completely free. Late that night, the heavy, suffocating silence of my sparse officer quarters at Camp Lejeune was violently shattered by the sharp vibration of my cell phone against the unvarnished pine desk. The screen illuminated the dark room with a cold blue glow, buzzing persistently against an empty glass, until I reached out and pressed the cold glass to my ear. When I answered with my customary crisp composure, the stern, mechanical voice of a precinct dispatcher came through the static, completely devoid of personal warmth or emotion, as she read directly from an official intake script. "Excuse me, is this Grace Vance? We just received an emergency stolen vehicle report from someone claiming to be the rightful owner of the charcoal SUV you are currently holding." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second, absorbing her words as the cold glass rested heavily against my cheekbone. Slowly, deliberately, I swung my legs off the narrow bunk and planted both feet flat on the chilly concrete floor, my spine straightening automatically into military posture as the absurd circus officially commenced. Julian actually possessed the unmitigated audacity to report me to civilian authorities for stealing my own vehicle, risking my 15-year career and facing potential federal grand theft felony charges just to save face in front of our mother and his country club friends. If his malicious accusations stuck, my entire military record, every promotion, every medal, and every drop of blood I had shed overseas would be utterly incinerated by a felony conviction. The dispatcher cleared her throat through the crackling line, her voice shifting slightly. "Ma'am, The reporting party, Mr. Julian Vance, is pressing for an immediate felony warrant. I need you to confirm the status and location of the vehicle right now." I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow a single tremor of panic to betray my thoughts. I regulated my breathing, leveled my gaze at the bare wall, and spoke with the freezing, calculated precision of a commander issuing tactical directives under heavy enemy fire. "Ma'am, I am Lieutenant Colonel Grace Vance, United States Marine Corps," I stated, instantly dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees with my rank alone. "I am currently holding the vehicle, and I did not steal it from anyone, because I am the sole legal owner of this automobile." The dispatcher hesitated on the line, the rapid tapping of her keyboard coming to an abrupt halt as the crackling static filled the silence between us. My authoritative title and unyielding, icy composure had clearly caught her off guard, prompting a noticeable shift in her tone from rigid confrontation to cautious professionalism. "Colonel Vance," she said carefully, treading lightly now, "the reporting party insists the vehicle belongs to him and claims to possess signed transfer documentation." I cracked my knuckles one by one, each sharp pop echoing off the bare concrete walls of my quarters. A cold, knowing smile touching my lips as the trap sprung shut. "He is lying," I fired back, opening my laptop with swift, practiced motions as the screen illuminated my face with sharp blue shadows. "I will email you digital copies of the original title, state registration, insurance policy, and bill of sale right now. All of them bear only one name: Grace Vance." Navigating directly to my encrypted military backup folder, I pulled up the digitized records I maintained with rigorous precision. Documents that proved beyond any legal doubt that the luxury vehicle belonged exclusively to me. Furthermore, I attached my official military deployment logs and flight manifests from the Department of Defense, demonstrating that on the exact date Julian claimed I had signed transfer papers over to him, I was actively commanding a Marine battalion 4,000 miles away in the Middle East. With a single decisive keystroke, I transmitted the entire evidence package directly to the precinct's official intake portal. The dispatcher confirmed receipt within seconds, her voice growing noticeably hushed as she reviewed the documents. By attempting to weaponize the law to steal my property and destroy my reputation, Julian had not only filed a false police report, but he had also committed federal identity theft and document fraud. The very trap he had set for me had snapped shut around his own wrist, transforming his arrogant lie into a criminal felony that would bring patrol cars straight to our mother's porch before the night was over. Standing in the quiet room, I felt the heavy chains of silence break away forever, replaced by an unyielding resolve to reclaim my truth. Early Monday morning, before the autumn sun had fully cleared the horizon, I marched straight into the office of Colonel Richard Benson, my civil legal advisor and the head staff judge advocate officer for the base command. Benson was a battle-tested Marine veteran who had known me since I was a green, naive second lieutenant, fresh out of officer candidate school, back when I carried blind loyalty in my heart and stars in my eyes. He had watched my ascension through the officer ranks, signed off on my overseas combat deployments, and served as the closest thing to a father figure I had left in this world since my father Arthur's passing. He didn't offer a polite greeting or a cup of morning coffee. Instead, he dropped a thick, densely packed dossier onto his mahogany desk with a heavy thud. "Grace, Department of Defense Security just flagged your top-secret clearance for severe financial anomalies," Benson said grimly, his sharp gray eyes locking onto mine with profound concern. "I had to personally pull your comprehensive credit report to stop them from revoking your security access immediately. Look at this mess." I flipped through the densely printed pages, my stomach churning as I scanned line after line of staggering, unpayable debt. There were massive credit card balances, luxury designer invoices from high-end boutiques I had never set foot in, 5-star restaurant tabs running into the thousands, and exclusive country club memberships, all charged to the supplementary cards I had issued to my mother strictly for groceries and emergency medical expenses. Julian and his wife Chloe had systematically used those cards as an unlimited blank check to finance their opulent fake lifestyle, draining my credit to the point of structural collapse. "They are bleeding you to the bone, Grace," Colonel Benson said softly, his voice dropping into a stern, disappointed reprimand that cut right through my military armor. "You command hundreds of Marines in combat, yet you let these domestic parasites destroy your life. Why do you continue to allow this?" His words hit me like a physical blow, stripping away every lingering illusion and forcing me to confront the destructive cost of my blind loyalty. I lowered my head, my eyes drifting to the small, framed photograph of my late father, Arthur Vance, tucked behind my military ID badge on the corner of the desk. In the faded picture, he stood proudly in his old garage coveralls, his hands stained with motor oil, a man of absolute integrity who had worked 2 jobs his entire life without ever complaining or asking for a handout. I was afraid, I confessed softly, my voice trembling slightly as 15 years of buried psychological conditioning broke through my tough exterior. I was afraid that if I stopped paying, my mother would completely disown me, and I would lose the only family I have left. Benson leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the desk, shaking his head with deep, paternal sympathy. "Grace, buying affection with money isn't family. It's emotional blackmail," he said firmly. "Your father worked himself to the bone to keep your family honest, and he would never tolerate this exploitation. You are funding your own erasure." Hearing my father's honorable memory invoked with such unvarnished truth acted like a blinding surge of electricity through my spirit, instantly shattering the thick psychological fog that had clouded my judgment for over a decade. I looked up, my eyes locking onto Benson's with lethal, uncompromising focus. "Colonel, I'm done," I stated, discarding the last shred of civilian weakness. "I need to sever every financial artery tied to them immediately." Benson immediately slid his secure desk phone toward me, hitting the executive speaker button. Within minutes, I reached my bank's priority line, authenticated my credentials, and issued a sweeping, non-negotiable directive. Freeze every supplementary credit card tied to my primary account, immediately. Revoke all authorized user privileges for Eleanor and Julian Vance, and decline all pending transactions statewide. In less than 30 seconds, their financial lifeline was permanently severed. Turning to the computer terminal, I logged into my service members group life insurance portal and officially deleted both my mother and brother as primary beneficiaries of my $500,000 policy, redirecting the funds entirely to the Wounded Warrior Project. If I fell in battle, they would never profit from my blood again. The final, decisive blow against their reign of parasitic exploitation lay in the legal ownership of our family home on Maple Ridge Drive, the very property that Chloe had loudly proclaimed to be her husband's inherited ancestral estate. Legally, my name was the only one listed on the property deed, as I had paid off the entire mortgage using my tax-free combat hazard pay and deployment savings without a single penny ever contributed by my brother. Colonel Benson pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from his drawer and placed them firmly on the desk before me. This is a formal 30-day notice to quit and vacate, drafted by our civilian legal counsel, Benson explained with clinical precision. By transferring the title of the property into an irrevocable living trust dedicated to disabled veteran housing and signing this eviction notice, you are taking back complete legal control of your asset. Your attorney will serve them formally, giving them exactly 30 days to pack their bags, vacate the premises, and face the real world without your financial safety net. I picked up the heavy brass pen, feeling its cool weight against my calloused fingers, knowing that this document represented the ultimate boundary between self-preservation and lifelong destruction. Every brick of that house had been paid for through nights I hadn't slept, wounds I hadn't reported, and years of life I had sacrificed far from home. I pressed the pen firmly to the paper and signed page after page, my hand perfectly steady, my mind completely unburdened by guilt. For the first time in my 39 years, I chose cold logic, self-respect, and absolute justice over toxic bloodlines and emotional manipulation. As I handed the completed dossier back to Colonel Benson, a profound, weightless sense of liberation washed over my soul. The era of the silent ATM was officially over. The battle lines were drawn, and I was completely prepared for the storm that was about to break. I stood tall in the quiet office, knowing that stepping into the light of truth was the only way to heal my fractured spirit and secure my future. By late Monday afternoon, the catastrophic chain reaction unleashed by my financial cutoff began to shred the fragile, gilded existence my family had built on my blood money. The financial guillotine had fallen with surgical precision, severing their access to my credit accounts at every single register across the state. At the upscale local supermarket, my mother Eleanor stood at the checkout counter with a cart filled with artisanal delicacies, her face flushing with intense embarrassment as the POS terminal flashed a glaring red message: declined, contact bank. As the cashier quietly requested another form of payment and the line of affluent shoppers behind her began to murmur in annoyance, my mother was forced to abandon her groceries and hurry out to the parking lot in utter humiliation. Meanwhile, Julian was at an expensive downtown hair salon when his card was rejected for a $300 treatment, leaving him sputtering in helpless rage as he was forced to write a check from a personal checking account that held less than $40. Worse yet, Julian had just received a terrifying official phone call from a senior detective at the Charleston Police Department regarding his fraudulent stolen vehicle report, informing him that an active felony investigation had been opened against him for grand theft fraud and filing a false police report. Instead of calling me to apologize or acknowledging the profound damage they had caused, my mother, brother, and sister-in-law piled into a small, dented rental sedan and drove straight toward Camp Lejeune, abandoning whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left. They were utterly convinced that if they made a massive, hysterical public spectacle at my workplace, they could bully, guilt, and shame their personal ATM into restoring their unlimited credit stream. They drove through the fading evening light, fueled by raw panic and toxic entitlement, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman waiting for them at the military base was no longer the desperate, compliant daughter they had manipulated for 15 long years. Their desperate journey was a pathetic attempt to reclaim an empire of lies, completely unaware that reality was about to crush their illusions forever. The frantic trio arrived at the main security checkpoint of Camp Lejeune just as the golden afternoon light was turning into deep twilight, instantly creating a chaotic scene that drew the immediate attention of the heavily armed military police stationed at the gate. My mother, Julian, and Chloe tumbled out of the rental sedan, screaming my name hysterically and demanding immediate entry, while threatening to contact their state congressman if they were not escorted to my office at once. However, a United States military base is a heavily fortified federal installation governed by strict security protocols, not a suburban country club where public tantrums yield immediate compliance. Recognizing an active security breach, the armed gate guards maintained absolute composure, placing their hands on their sidearms and ordering the 3 trespassers onto the gravel shoulder before radioing my command center to report 3 disorderly civilians creating a disturbance at the main gate. When the radio call reached my desk, I stood up calmly, smoothed the front of my starched utility uniform, adjusted my garrison cover with practiced precision, and walked out into the crisp evening air. As I marched toward the main gate with a measured, deliberate cadence, my heart rate remained at a steady 60 beats per minute. The deep-seated anxiety and desperate need for familial approval that had controlled my life for 15 years had completely evaporated, replaced by the quiet, untouchable authority of a Marine commander in total control of her environment. Standing on federal property, wearing my crisp combat utilities with my polished insignia glinting in the twilight, I stepped toward the gate to confront the ghosts of my past. I felt no fear, no hesitation, and no urge to apologize, standing tall as an unbreakable wall of truth against the chaotic storm of their greed. Every step I took toward that fence was a conscious reclamation of my own dignity, proving that the scared child who once begged for love had finally grown into a warrior who commanded respect. Standing before them, I was no longer a victim of their emotional blackmail, but a sovereign woman who had reclaimed her life, her honor, and her peace. As I approached the heavy iron gates, the stark, unyielding contrast between our 2 worlds was physically jarring to everyone present. On one side stood a decorated Marine officer in perfect formation, spine straight, chin level, radiating cold, untouchable authority forged through years of discipline and sacrifice. On the other side stood 3 frantic, disheveled civilians, clawing at the air like drowning rats, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of panic, entitlement, and unbridled rage. The second Julian spotted me through the security fencing, he lunged forward, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at my chest, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson as his composure shattered completely.
"What the hell did you do to my credit cards? Where is my car?" he screamed, his voice cracking with unhinged desperation as he attempted to physically intimidate me by invading my personal space, his spit hitting the gravel between us. I did not flinch, nor did I allow my eyes to blink. I stood my ground with immovable dignity, staring at him as if he were nothing more than an unpleasant stain on the pavement, while the heavily armed military police watched his every twitch from 10 feet away, ready to take him face down into the dirt at his first aggressive movement. I did not waste my breath arguing with him. Words were entirely useless against a man who had never earned a single dollar of his own possessions and whose entire identity was built on stolen manila folder and handed it directly to the state trooper who had arrived beside the gate guards. The officer stepped forward, took the documents, and approached Julian with quiet, clinical authority. Inside that folder lay the complete evidence of Julian's federal document fraud, along with the formal notice to vacate my home, legally served to him in front of sworn law enforcement witnesses. Serving that notice to vacate on federal ground was the ultimate boundary I had to draw, proving that my sacrifice would no longer be exploited by a parasitic family that had never valued my existence. Chloe, ever desperate to assess their financial collapse, dropped to her knees on the dirty gravel to examine the scattered papers, her manicured nails scraping against the harsh asphalt as one snapped clean off with a sharp crack. As her eyes scanned the formal 30-day eviction notice and the mountain of debt statements bearing her husband's name, the color drained entirely from her face, and she looked up at me in hollow horror, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "What is this? You sold our house?"
she stammered, her voice shaking violently as her delusion of wealth crumbled around her. I stepped closer to the barrier, my shadow falling across her trembling frame, and corrected her delusional entitlement forever. "My house," I enunciated with icy, mathematical precision. "And I have transferred it to a veteran housing trust. You have exactly 30 days to pack your bags and leave." Realizing that their free ride was permanently over, my mother lost whatever remaining grip on sanity she possessed. She shrieked like a wild animal, her face twisting into an ugly mask of primal fury as she lunged toward the gate, her bony fingers clawing at the starched fabric of my sleeve. She deployed the exact emotional weapon she had sharpened and perfected over 40 years of toxic manipulation, expecting me to fold, weep, and hand over my checkbook, as I had always done in the past. But as I looked directly into her eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. The frightened little girl who had spent 15 years begging for her love was dead and buried in the Afghan desert. The emotional weapon that had held me hostage for decades struck my heart and shattered into useless dust against the iron plating of my self-respect. In that transformative moment, Standing in the cold twilight, I felt the final fragments of my childhood trauma dissolve, replaced by an unshakable sense of emotional freedom and self-worth. I silenced my mother's screaming with a final, lethal strike, delivered with the same cold, unwavering composure I used to issue tactical commands under enemy fire. From now on, you have your precious golden son to rely on, I said, my voice cutting through the evening wind like a sharp blade. You always told me he was the capable one, the saint who carried the family. Let him feed you. I am no longer this family's bank. Turning toward the state trooper and the military police officers, I gave a crisp, formal instruction. Officer, please detain Mr. Julian Vance. There is an active felony warrant for his arrest regarding false police reporting and grand theft fraud. Before Julian could utter a word of protest or attempt to flee, the state trooper grabbed his arm, spun him around against the hood of the rental sedan, and snapped metal handcuffs around his wrists. Julian let out a pathetic, suffocated whimper as his country club illusion vanished into the cold night air, his face turning pale as he was led toward the back of a police cruiser. Eleanor collapsed onto the gravel, sobbing hysterically as her golden boy was taken into custody, her dramatic performance falling on deaf ears as the officers completed their duty. I turned on my heel and walked back into the military compound, my combat boots striking the pavement with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I did not look back, not even once. The heavy chains of guilt and toxic obligation that had bound my soul for 15 years were severed forever, leaving me walking into the quiet evening whole, unburdened, and completely free. The war for my self-respect was won, and as I stepped into my quarters, I felt the deep, healing warmth of true peace settle over my spirit. As the cold night air settled around the silent grounds of Camp Lejeune, I stood tall, completely unburdened, knowing that my journey toward true healing had officially begun, anchored forever in the unshakable knowledge that I was worthy of respect, love, and absolute freedom. In the immediate aftermath of my decisive financial cutoff, the artificial universe my family had spent over a decade constructing on my blood money collapsed with terrifying, relentless speed. Stripped of the supplementary credit cards that had quietly bankrolled their superficial vanity, Julian's grand illusion of entrepreneurial success disintegrated overnight. His remaining personal credit cards were rejected at every high-end restaurant, luxury boutique, and private lounge in Charleston, forcing him to face the cold, unvarnished reality of an empty bank account. The affluent country club acquaintances he had lavished with expensive dinners, fine cigars, and imported bourbon vanished into thin air the exact moment they realized he was a penniless fraud living on his sister's military hazard pay. By Thursday afternoon, his so-called corporate partners stopped returning his calls. By Friday morning, the country club officially revoked his guest privileges. And on Saturday, a flatbed tow truck pulled up to the curb to repossess his personal luxury sedan while the neighbors watched through their blinds. Reality was tearing his fake empire apart piece by piece, and I did not have to lift a single finger to hasten its downfall.
For the first time in his 40 years of existence, Julian was forced to navigate the real world without my checking account as a protective cushion. Meanwhile, the phone in my quarters rang incessantly as nosy extended family members called to express their self-righteous outrage. Aunt Karen called to scream into the receiver that I was a cold-blooded, unfilial monster for abandoning my own flesh and blood during a crisis. I sat on my bunk, took a slow sip of ice water, and calmly replied that if she truly cared about their well-being, she was welcome to take my mother and Julian into her own home and cover their expenses. The line went dead silent for 3 full seconds before Aunt Karen stammered a hasty excuse about limited guest room space and hung up immediately. Their righteous moral indignation evaporated the very instant it came with an actual price tag, proving that their loyalty was as cheap as the unsolicited advice they offered. Chloe, my pragmatic, status-obsessed sister-in-law, was the first among them to break under the crushing weight of their sudden impoverishment. When she finally grasped that her husband was a penniless beggar with 0 assets, no job, a pending felony charge, and an impending eviction notice, her gilded world collapsed like a house built on wet sand. Late one evening, bypassing my mother entirely, she called my personal cell phone, sobbing hysterically into the speaker with a desperate panic that choked her breath. "I didn't know, Grace. I swear to God, I didn't know," she wailed, her voice cracking between heavy, ragged gasps. "Julian told me his business was booming. He told me all that money was his own." I listened in absolute, unbroken silence for 30 seconds, offering no comfort, no reassurance, and no warmth to a woman who had once stood in my kitchen planning to demolish my walls for better feng shui. I ended the call without uttering a single word, recognizing that her frantic tears were not born of genuine remorse or spiritual awakening, but were simply the painful product of an empty bank account. She was not sorry for the years she had spent exploiting my sacrifice. She was merely terrified of the cold, unglamorous life that now awaited her. Instead of engaging in their endless domestic drama, I stayed on base, drinking bitter black coffee in the break room with Master Sergeant Sullivan and seeking the quiet, grounded guidance of Chaplain Michael, a battle-tested veteran who had guided countless traumatized soldiers through moral injury. Sitting back in the plastic chair, watching the harsh fluorescent light flicker overhead while listening to the distant, rhythmic cadence of recruits running drills outside, I felt a deep sense of healing settle over my chest. Their boots hit the pavement in unison, a steady, honest sound that reminded me that truth was the ultimate cleanser, stripping away the toxic decay so that real integrity could finally take root. Standing in that quiet break room, holding a warm cup of coffee, I understood that setting a boundary was not an act of cruelty, but a sacred duty to my own soul. It allowed me to step out from under the heavy shadow of their entitlement and embrace a future where my worth was no longer measured by the money I provided, but by the peace I carried in my heart. As the 30-day eviction deadline loomed critically close, Julian faced a devastating legal crossroads. Either fight a losing battle against federal fraud charges that carried a 5-year prison sentence, or accept a strict, court-mandated pretrial diversion program that I had arranged through my legal counsel.
Under the uncompromising terms of this agreement, federal prosecution would be deferred on one absolute condition. Julian had to submit to mandatory financial supervision, undergo court-monitored rehabilitation, and secure immediate, verifiable employment in manual labor, whether as a concrete pourer, a mechanic, or a construction hand. Furthermore, my mother Eleanor was required to move into a modest, one-bedroom rental apartment and learn to live strictly within the boundaries of her monthly Social Security pension. On a freezing Sunday evening, just 3 days before the county sheriff was scheduled to execute the formal eviction order, a desperate, sharp knock rattled the door of my off-base rental apartment. 3 sharp bangs vibrated through the thin wooden frame, followed by a heavy silence, and then 3 more. I set down my coffee mug, walked to the hallway, and pulled the door open. Standing there, on the cold concrete porch in the biting winter air, were Julian and my mother. All their former arrogance had burned away. There were no Italian silk suits, no designer shoes, no smirks, and no fingers pointed at my chest. My mother wore a thin, faded coat, her unwashed hair pulled into a messy knot, while Julian looked hollowed out and broken, his eyes red-rimmed and sunken, his clothes wrinkled and stained. They stood shivering in the dark, stripped of their superficial armor, forced at last to confront the daughter and sister they had used so ruthlessly. The cold night wind swept across the threshold, carrying with it the bitter taste of reality that neither of them could longer escape. Their sudden arrival at my door was not a surprise, but the inevitable collision between a lifetime of unearned privilege and the unyielding wall of consequence. Standing on the threshold, looking into their tired, desperate eyes, I knew that the moment of ultimate reckoning had finally arrived. For all of us. Standing in the doorway, with my arms crossed tightly over my chest, I allowed a long, punishing silence to stretch between us, offering no welcoming gesture, no warm greeting, and no invitation to step inside out of the cold. My mother immediately attempted to play her familiar emotional cards, weeping loudly and reaching out to grab my sleeve, trying to summon the ghost of maternal love to shatter my defenses. Her tears rolled down her cheeks in heavy streams, but her eyes kept darting past me into the apartment, scanning for any sign of comfort or cash she could leverage. But the real shock came from Julian, the former golden child, the self-proclaimed entrepreneur, the man who had spent 40 years puffing his chest and claiming my possessions as his own. He collapsed onto his knees on the cold porch, his body folding forward until his forehead pressed against the rough floorboards, sobbing with a violent, ugly intensity that shook his entire frame. He slammed his calloused fist weakly against the wood, his voice cracking violently as 40 years of suppressed shame broke open. "I hate it, Grace," he screamed through his tears. "I hate your damn uniform. I hate every single medal on your chest. I hate that every time you walk into a room, everybody looks at you with real respect. And I'm 40 years old, and I am nothing without you." Looking down at his crumpled form, I realized that his luxury suits had just been armor to hide his own profound failure.
And his fake business was merely a costume to cover the crushing shame of being completely dependent on his younger sister. For a fleeting second, my heart ached, and I felt the old, familiar urge to reach for my checkbook to fix his pain, as I had always done. But my resolve, forged through war and self-preservation, held firm. I knew that handing him a blank check would only poison his soul further, restarting the vicious cycle of entitlement that had destroyed us all. I refused to enable him to remain a child in a man's body any longer, knowing that true compassion sometimes requires us to step back and allow the fire of accountability to consume the lies people tell themselves. In that quiet hallway, I stood as a wall of cold, unshakable truth, watching the golden child face his own reflection. I stepped back, forcing Julian to remain on the floor and face his own ruin without my hand pulling him up out of the dirt. I will pay exactly one emergency debt installment directly to the landlord, so your 2 children do not end up on the street, I commanded, my voice echoing off the bare walls with absolute, unyielding authority. But only on one condition. You must sign the pretrial diversion contract tomorrow morning and begin work on a construction crew pouring concrete 6 days a week. And Mom, you move into the small rental apartment and live strictly on your pension. There will be no negotiations, no supplementary cards, and no second chances. My mother opened her mouth to protest, her lips reflexively forming the word ungrateful. But I raised a single finger to silence her, and she snapped her mouth shut in silent submission. Julian looked up from the floor, his face streaked with tears and dirt, and nodded slowly, accepting the bitter terms of his redemption. It was the harshest, most uncompromising form of love I had ever delivered, crueler than any order I'd issued in combat, yet infinitely more merciful than allowing them to rot in their own delusions. I was forcing them to burn to ashes so they could finally learn how to rebuild themselves from the ground up on a foundation of honest labor. Closing the door firmly, I walked back to my kitchen table and sat down alone in the quiet apartment, listening to their footsteps fade down the cold stairwell. 1 year later, Julian didn't wear Italian silk suits anymore. His skin was deeply tanned from months of brutal sun exposure, and his hands were calloused hard and permanently stained with motor oil. He was driving a beat-up pickup truck to his construction job, pouring concrete foundations 6 days a week, finally earning his own meal and finding real dignity in honest work. Sitting alone in that sunlit room a year later, I took a deep breath of the quiet afternoon air, knowing that stopping their rescue was the greatest act of love I had ever performed. I was finally at peace, whole and free. 1 year after the seismic shift that dismantled our family's toxic foundation, my 40-year-old brother, Julian, no longer wore Italian silk suits, drove leased luxury sedans, or bragged about non-existent corporate empires to shallow country club acquaintances. His skin had turned a deep, weathered copper from 12 long months of brutal sun exposure on commercial construction sites across West Virginia, and his hands were thick, calloused, and permanently stained with motor oil and concrete dust that no amount of industrial soap could completely remove. He was driving a beat-up, dark blue 2012 Ford F-150 with a cracked windshield,
a dented side panel, and a rusted tailgate. A reliable workhorse he had purchased entirely himself, with hard-earned cash from hauling heavy lumber, tying rebar, and pouring reinforced concrete footings, 6 days a week. The superficial vanity and arrogant delusions of grandeur that had defined his youth were entirely dead, replaced by the quiet, steady, and unblinking gaze of a man who actually fed himself and his 2 young children through the honest sweat of his own brow. He was constantly exhausted at the end of every shift, his back aching relentlessly from heavy physical lifting, and his knees shot from kneeling on cold, wet concrete for hours at a time. But he was finally real. The pathetic costume of stolen wealth had been burned away in the furnace of hard, unyielding labor, leaving behind a human being who no longer needed to pretend to be a millionaire to justify his existence in the world. Julian looked 10 years older, but he looked 100 years more honest, having traded the fragile armor of borrowed luxury for the unshakable self-respect that only honest, grueling work can build. Watching him navigate his new life with quiet determination, I saw that the pretrial diversion program had not been a cruel punishment, but a sacred crucible that had stripped away his parasitic nature, giving him the rare, priceless opportunity to rebuild his character from the ground up and earn the genuine, lasting respect of his children. Standing beside him, I knew that his transformation was the ultimate proof that true dignity is never given. It must be forged through accountability and hard work. My 66-year-old mother, Eleanor, had undergone an equally profound, quiet transformation in her small, sunlit, one-bedroom rental apartment on Elm Street. Stripped of the unlimited supplementary credit cards she had once used to fund her lavish lifestyle, she had learned to navigate local grocery store aisles with clipping discount coupons in hand, carefully counting her change at the register, and comparing store brands through reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. The toxic, bitter insults that used to flow from her mouth like battery acid had vanished entirely, replaced by a cautious, deep-seated respect for every single dollar she spent from her modest monthly Social Security pension. She knew the exact price of a loaf of bread, the cost of a gallon of milk, and the true value of human dignity, having surrendered the bitter resentment that had poisoned her relationship with her daughter for over 15 years. We no longer hosted extravagant Mother's Day celebrations or gathered for expensive dinners in 5-star steakhouses on my dime. Instead, our family interactions had been grounded in simple, honest, and unvarnished reality. Eleanor had learned to take genuine pride in maintaining her small home without relying on external rescue, discovering a quiet peace that had eluded her during decades of financial dependency and toxic favoritism. She no longer spoke of Julian as a pampered prince who needed constant saving, nor did she treat my military career as an endless bank account designed for her exploitation. In place of her relentless demands was a quiet, contemplative stillness. A mother who had finally learned to accept her children for who they truly were, unburdened by the insatiable greed and emotional manipulation that had once destroyed our home and severed our sacred bond. In her gentle eyes, I finally saw the calm acceptance of a woman who had reconciled with her past and discovered the quiet comfort of living within her own means. She had learned that genuine peace comes from contentment rather than control, allowing us both to heal the deep wounds of our past and building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than endless financial transaction. On a warm, golden Saturday evening in late July 2026, our family gathered in the small, overgrown backyard of Julian's modest rental home for an unpretentious weekend meal. There were no country club acquaintances, no designer wine glasses, no silk tablecloths, and no grand performances designed to impress shallow neighbors. Just the rich aroma of cheap charcoal smoke drifting through the air and the rhythmic sound of pork chops sizzling on a rusty iron grate. Sitting on inexpensive folding plastic chairs scattered across the grass, we listened to the cheerful laughter of Julian's 2 young children as they chased a golden retriever around the yard, their joy pure, unburdened, and completely untainted by family drama. I walked into the backyard wearing my starched service dress uniform, the newly pinned silver eagle insignias of a full colonel glinting softly in the low afternoon light. Julian stood over the hot coals, sweat glistening on his forehead, turning the meat with a pair of bent metal tongs, while grease popped against his thick, muscular forearms that were now corded with real muscle earned from honest, daily labor on construction sites. My mother looked up as I approached, setting down a paper plate of potato salad on the wobbly plastic table. The deep-seated resentment that had once defined her eyes was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, shy gratitude that she didn't quite know how to articulate in words. She didn't offer a theatrical apology, nor did she shower me with artificial praise, but she quietly pulled out a chair, wiped the seat clean with the hem of her cardigan, and poured me a cold glass of iced tea from a plastic pitcher without being asked, offering me a simple, honest place at her table. That silent gesture spoke volumes, bridging years of painful distance with quiet grace, and signaling a profound, lasting shift in how we related to one another as a family. For the first time in my life, I felt truly welcome in my own family's presence. Not as a provider of funds, but simply as a daughter and sister who was valued for who she was, rather than what she could buy. Sitting beside my mother in that quiet, sun-drenched yard, watching my brother tend the fire with steady, practiced hands, I felt a wave of profound emotional healing wash over my spirit. For 15 long years, I had believed that love was something I had to purchase through endless financial sacrifice, constantly wiring my combat hazard pay home to buy brief moments of maternal approval and domestic peace. But looking at the simple spread before us, I realized that authentic dignity and true family connection cannot be inherited, gifted, or bankrolled through an unlimited credit card. They must be earned through blood, sweat, and mutual respect. My father, Arthur Vance, had understood this truth decades ago as he worked himself to the bone in his auto repair shop. And standing in that small yard, I knew his honorable spirit was finally at peace. Julian brought a platter of grilled meat to the table, wiping his hands on a clean shop towel, and offered me a genuine, unpretentious smile that carried no hidden motives or unspoken demands. "Thanks for coming, Grace," he said quietly, his voice carrying a grounded maturity I had never heard in his 40 years of life. "I bought the food myself, with my own paycheck." Those simple words carried more weight than all the luxury suits and expensive cars he had ever possessed, representing the total resurrection of a man who had finally discovered the quiet pride of earning his own bread. In that sacred, unhurried moment, we were no longer bound by financial transactions, but by a shared appreciation for genuine living, mutual honor, and the quiet dignity that comes from standing on our own feet. As I looked around the wobbly plastic table, I saw no remnants of the toxic entitlement that had once destroyed us. Only 3 human beings who had survived the storm of their own making and emerged on the other side wiser, stronger, and fundamentally whole. Looking out at my family as the golden light of dusk settled over the quiet neighborhood, I understood the deepest, most transformative truth of my journey. Stopping the rescue of a person is sometimes the most profound act of love you can ever perform. Cutting off a toxic financial lifeline is not an act of cruelty or abandonment, but the only sacred boundary that can truly resurrect a human soul from the paralyzing death of entitlement. For 15 years, my well-intentioned generosity had not been an act of sisterly devotion, but a destructive force that enabled my brother's weakness and fueled my mother's greed, trapping us all in a prison of mutual resentment. By standing firm, setting an unyielding boundary, and forcing them to face the phantoms of their own choices, I had given them the greatest gift possible: the opportunity to discover their own internal strength and reclaim their human dignity. As the clock struck 7 and a gentle night breeze rustled through the oak trees, I took a deep breath of the smoky air, feeling completely whole, unburdened, and profoundly at peace. I no longer needed my mother's validation to prove my worth, nor did I carry the heavy, suffocating guilt of a child trying to fix a broken home. I was Colonel Grace Vance, a woman who had survived foreign battlefields, conquered domestic parasites, and emerged with her honor, her dignity, and her soul fully intact. If life ever forces you to stand against the storm of toxic family expectations, I pray you find the courage to hold your line, protect your peace, and remember that true love never demands the surrender of your self-respect. For in the end, liberation begins the precise moment you stop bankrolling your own erasure and step boldly into the light of your own truth, claiming the peace you so richly deserve. Walking forward into the quiet evening, I knew that our new beginning was built on solid, immovable ground, anchored in absolute truth, deep healing, and enduring self-respect. As the stars began to glisten in the twilight sky, I smiled softly to myself, knowing that the longest battle of my life was finally over, and the victory belonged to truth, dignity, and love.